Hey everybody, Professor Benlou here with the second of 3 short videos. In this video, I will be discussing the first 3 topics you can go over, which will be the Bay of Pigs invasion, which will be the Cuban Missile Crisis, and will be the Vietnam War protests. Okay, so in this topic, the first topic, the primary document is a letter written by Presidential Advisor Richard N. Goodwin to President John F. Kennedy regarding the Bay of Pigs. So if you are interested in that topic, you have to have a good understanding of what occurred during the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961. This was at the very beginning of President Kennedy's time in office. In 1959, Cuban Revolution had brought the communist government of Fidel Castro to power in Havana. This was during President Dwight D. Eisenhower's time in office. The plan for the Bay of Pigs had actually been formulated during Eisenhower's time in office, but he did not have enough time to put it into play before leaving office in January 1961. So basically, President Kennedy inherited the plans for the Bay of Pigs operation. And basically, the Bay of Pigs was this. The CIA had trained a group of Cuban exiles, and this group, was to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And it was assumed that once the Cuban exiles began this invasion, Cuban citizens would help the Cuban exiles and they would all rise up and oust Fidel Castro from power. Okay. It did not happen that way, and we'll get into that. April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion indeed occurred. The U.S. government had promised the exiles that they would back them up with 2 airstrikes. After the first airstrike, it was obvious that the U.S. government was involved. So President Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. About 1,200 exiles were taken prisoner as a result of the Bay of Pigs, and 100 were killed. President Kennedy eventually negotiated the release of the imprisoned exiles. This was an absolute disaster, an absolute fiasco. So anyway, that is the Bay of Pigs. Again, the primary document that you're going to analyze if you want to delve into this topic is a letter written by Presidential Advisor Richard N. Goodwin to President Kennedy regarding the Bay of Pigs. Okay, so the second topic, the second primary document is actually a YouTube video. And this YouTube video is President Kennedy addressing the nation regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, don't confuse this with the Bay of Pigs because a lot of students do. The Cuban Missile Crisis actually occurred a 1.5 years after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Bay of Pigs occurred in April of 1961, and the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in October of 1962. An extremely tense 13 days. We're going to get into this. October of 1962, U.S. military surveillance planes had photographed nuclear missile sites being constructed by the Soviet Union within Cuba. The Kennedy administration had 2 options as to responding to this information. First, order an invasion of Cuba, where a 1.5 years after the Bay of Pigs invasion, maybe not so much. And secondly, placing a naval blockade against Cuba. Kennedy chose to place a naval blockade against Cuba because it was feared that invasion would lead to retaliation from the Soviets. Negotiations lasted a nail-biting 13 days. It was the closest that the U.S. had ever been to nuclear war. It's interesting. It was really, really tense and really, really crazy. In fact, the Kennedys famously had a mansion on Palm Beach, and there's a place called Peanut Island not far off Palm Beach, and President Kennedy had a nuclear bunker. And you used to be able to tour it, but it makes me sad they let it go in disrepair and stop the tours. But anyway, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother, wrote of his experience as a cabinet member during the Cuban Missile Crisis within his book called 13 Days. Really great book to read if you want something interesting to read. It's not a long book, and it's really interesting. They also turned 13 Days into an incredible movie. The Soviets ended up removing the missiles from Cuba in exchange for U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. What was not known to the American public at the time, and not until fairly recently, is the fact that the U.S. agreed to remove its missiles from Greece and Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles from Cuba. It's funny because, during the Cold War, up until, 1989, 1990, when students were taught the Cuban Missile Crisis in history class, it was, well, darn it, we stared down those Soviets and they blinked and removed the missiles from Cuba. Well, not necessarily so. there's a little more to it. We agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey and Greece as well. All right, so that is topic number 2. Topic number 3, the last one that I will go over in this video, is the Vietnam War protests. The primary document you will be analyzing, if you choose to analyze this topic, is a speech that John Kerry made in front of a congressional committee April 23rd, 1971, in protest of the war in Vietnam. Okay, little background of John Kerry. John Kerry served as a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts from 1985 until 2013. He was the Democratic Party nominee in 2004 for president, and he served as Secretary of State during President Obama's second term from 2013 to 2017. But the time period we're talking about is right after he left his service in Vietnam. 1966 to 1970, Kerry served as a lieutenant in the United States Navy fighting in Vietnam, and he came home very disillusioned like many of those that fought in Vietnam, and this led him to join a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Vietnam Veterans Against the War was a group formed in 1967, and basically its members were those that had bravely served in Vietnam and were now against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So Kerry was chosen to give this speech in front of a congressional committee on behalf of this group on April 23rd, 1971. And that is the last topic I am going to be going over in this video. The third and final video, I will be going over the women's rights movement topic, the Chicano rights movement topic, and the Black Power movement topic. All right, everybody.